We're entering the last week of a very tight presidential election. I can't tell you who's going to win, but hopefully I can explain some of the things that are going on. The two candidates have made their closing arguments. Donald Trump at a rally last week at Madison Square Garden, and Kamala Harris on the ellipse last night in Washington, D.C. at a massive rally. Those events told us a lot about the strategies of the two candidates as they enter the last week. The contrast between them could not be more stark. Trump's message was one of grievance, retribution, hate, and division. His strategy was not to try to convert undecided voters. It was not to reach out to voters who are not already his supporters, but rather it was to double down on his hardcore MAGA message in the hopes that there are hidden MAGA voters who will be drawn to the polls by that rhetoric. Harris's message was one of freedom, inclusion, optimism, and hope. Her strategy is to try to convert undecided voters who her campaign believes are mostly Republicans or Republican-leaning independents who simply don't want to vote for Donald Trump. His strategy is based on a premise that by the sharp rhetoric, he can draw to the polls enough hidden Trump voters, hidden MAGA supporters, who would otherwise not vote, to flip some of the swing states into his camp, and so he can win an election in the Electoral College like he did in 2016. Her strategy is based on the premise that Trump can't win a majority, that he's got a hard ceiling at about 47%, and that if she can just consolidate all of the anti-Trump vote, she'll win the election. The symbol of the Trump campaign is J.D. Vance, not an appeal outside of his base, but a real hard doubling down on his base. The symbol of the Harris campaign is Liz Cheney. She represents Republicans or Republican-leaning independents who probably in an ordinary election would vote Republican under the circumstances of this year, but just can't vote for Donald Trump. The polls say this is a dead heat, and I'm not going to try to analyze them because there are so many of them. They're so confusing. Let's just say this election is very tight. But I do want to just talk about one other point because I think it's important to understand what's going on. And that is the electorate is divided because the country is divided. In the last 3 or 4 decades, this country has undergone enormous and rapid demographic, cultural, and political change. Ron Brownstein at CNN and The Atlantic has written the best stuff about this. But let me give you a couple of examples in how it affects the election. When I was working for Bill Clinton in 1992, in that campaign, 88% of the electorate was white. About 10 or 12% were black. There weren't even enough Hispanics to register on the exit polls. In 2020, just 67%, 2/3 of the electorate was white, and 12 or 13% were black, and maybe 13 or 14% Hispanic. But it's a very different electorate. So you have to run a very different campaign. In 1984, when Ronald Reagan won a re-election, 2/3 of the voters were 67% were non-college whites, in other words, white voters who didn't have a college education. They've been the majority of the electorate since the beginning of the Republic, or the largest component. But they've been decreasing rapidly in the last 30 years. And in 2024, for the first time, they're going to be less than 40% of the electorate. Now, how does that affect the outcome? Reagan and Trump Reagan in 1984 and Trump in 2020 got exactly the same, or just about the same, percentage of those non-college whites. The difference was that because they were such a much bigger part of the electorate, the whole electorate in 1984, Reagan won 59% of the vote. Trump, on the other hand, won under 47%. So it makes a big difference. I think the division in the country is between those who want to embrace that change and those who want to slow it or stop it. Harris is on the side of those who want to embrace it. Trump, as evidenced by his deportation policies and plans, is on the side of those who want to stop it. Over the long haul, the Harris side will win. The question is whether they'll win in 2024, and that's what will be determined in a week.